That'll yield something, but it's still really liquid money. So you're going to be able to pull it out whenever you want. So it's not going to yield a lot. Conversely, loans are probably some of the most illiquid assets that a bank has, and we find that loans yield a lot. Loans, have really high interest rates. Most of that interest rate is for the credit risk, but there's also some component that's for the liquidity risk of the loans. So, to make a long story short, a short story long, one of the costs of having really high liquidity on your balance sheet is you don't get to reap those liquidity premiums. So again, it's less profitable. The cost associated with liability side liquidity risk management, that is holding a lot of borrowing capacity, is going to be that you don't actually have these loans. If I have to pledge these loans against borrowing lines, that means I don't have them for asset side risk management. I can't sell them off anymore because these loans, the certificates of these loans, live in the Federal Home Loan Bank's offices now, or the Federal Reserve's offices. Same with my securities. If I pledge my securities against borrowing lines, I don't have access to them. So that's going to be a cost associated with liability side risk management. Liability side liquidity risk management, that's a mouthful. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's think about it the other way now. Earnings risk, right? Earnings risk is basically the risk that you won't be able to make enough money. You thought you were going to make more money, but you can't. Okay, so that's a really easy problem to fix. Just have assets that pay a lot of money. What's the risk associated with that? Why don't banks just, deploy all their money on Alt-A lending or like super low income lending that they can charge these people a lot more because it's much riskier. So they trade off earnings risk for asset risk, capital risk. All these dimensions and components are interrelated, and there's a trade-off associated with all of them. And I think it's going to be important to understand, not just for the test, but in general, if you want to understand how a bank works, to understand the trade-off between, okay, this is what I can do to mitigate asset risk, but at the same time, that exacerbates earnings risk. Words for make something better, make something worse, right? So think about that for a little bit. And the last component of risk that we talked about, the S in camels, which was basically interest rate risk. If you guys will recall, that's the risk that rates will move against you, right? And rates can move against you either up or down, depending on what your balance sheet position is. And we talked about that's going to be a homework question, so I want you guys to give it some thought. I fully understand that I'm willing to help you guys, and when you give it some thought and have some questions, come to my office hours and help. But we talked about one of the things that banks can do to mitigate this interest rate risk is to maturity match their portfolio. That is, have assets and liabilities that come to maturity around the same time. That way, once both of those things reprice, they reprice at the same market rates. So you won't have the situation like we did in the practice problem where you have a CD that reprices in 2 years. So if you want to keep that customer, you're going to have to pay him the new market price, which is higher, whereas your loan reprices in 10 years. So your margin's going to get squeezed. The difference between your interest income and your interest expense is going to get squeezed. So one way to avoid that situation is by having assets and liabilities that reprice around the same time. So that if they both reprice in a high interest rate environment, then you'll have to pay more money, but you'll get more money too. If they both reprice in a low interest rate environment, then you'll earn less money, but you have to pay less money as well. And so that's just without considering optionality in the portfolio. But if you think about the most common type of loan that banks make, typically are mortgages, instruments that have options. The consumer has the option to prepay the mortgage or to call the mortgage and get a new mortgage at a lower rate. So the consumer will exercise that option if rates go down. So one thing that banks can do to eliminate that risk is to sell all those mortgages. Sure, they'll make the mortgages, but then they sell it to Fannie Mae or JP Morgan, who package these up and turn them into securities. And that way, even if the customer calls the option, even if the customer prepays or refinances, that is no longer going to affect the bank because it's off the bank's books. The bank doesn't care. So you can't really do that for commercial loans. Like when a business goes and gets a loan, there's not as liquid of a market for these. There are commercial mortgage-backed securities, but for instance, C&I loans, just a commercial line of credit, there's no secondary market for that. There's no Fannie Mae that exists for that. So what banks have to do to protect themselves against the interest rate risk there is they just don't give the consumer the option. They impose such high prepayment penalties that it would seldom be in the consumer's best interest to refinance. Because can you guys understand that refinancing is like prepayment? I guess first I should ask, do you guys all understand what prepayment is? What I mean by prepayment? No, so, okay, that should have been a starting point. I'm sorry about that. Basically, every month in a mortgage, you have a contractual payment, right? But you can, and if you're smart, you will choose to pay more than that and pay off your mortgage ahead of time. And that helps you, reduce your interest expense in the long run. That's a problem for a bank because they don't know which cash flows to expect, right? And that's just, if my payment is $500 and I choose to pay $600, that's a prepayment. If you think about a refinance, it's the same concept, except instead of paying 20% more, I just pay them the whole damn thing. I just give you all the money for my mortgage, and then I go get another mortgage from another bank. So this bank got all their payoff 15 years before they thought they were getting their payoff. So in that sense, prepayment is basically, or I should say that refinance is a subset of prepayment. Make sense? Okay. We'll get done talking about boring stuff soon, I swear. So yeah, that's one thing that banks can do to protect themselves against option risk is just to make really high prepayment penalties. And still you're going to have to pay a refinance cost, but it's generally affordable. Versus on business loans, prepayment penalties are cost prohibitive. Okay. So we move on to sort of taking a macro stance on it. So we spent a lot of time thinking of the perspective of a bank manager, and I think that's really important to think about because some of you guys are going to be in business and are going to manage businesses and are going to have to deal with banks, and it's important to understand from their perspective. But this next section is just going to be a more general perspective, just so you're familiar with what's going on in the American banking sector. And I think that'll take us through the day. So we mentioned earlier that in the infancy of this country, Americans were paranoid, just absolutely paranoid of any sort of centralized power. We were very, very libertarian, and we did not trust our government to be responsible for controlling money. And that's why we were really opposed to having a Federal Reserve. That's also why we were really opposed to having a central currency. A long time ago, every bank issued banknotes. And so there was no dollar bill until, mid-1800s, I think. But every bank sort of had their own dollar bills. And if you lived in one region, you maybe could trade with, maybe if you lived in South Carolina, maybe you could trade with a guy from Maine, but maybe you couldn't. So at some point, we realized that this was ridiculous and inefficient, and we had a central currency. And moreover, we started in the Reconstruction period after the, or around the time of the end of the Civil War, we started becoming more open to federalism. That is, the government trying to centralize power and control things from a more efficient standpoint. And one of the outcomes of this centralization was the introduction of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is, again, a mouthful, or the OCC. And so these guys were introduced for a very important reason. Basically, when you had a lot of different banks in a lot of different areas, nobody's really looking after them or looking over them. Some states would charter the banks, but states don't have enough resources to actually oversee the operations of these banks. What ended up happening again and again and again is these rational, profit-maximizing bank managers screwing over consumers, and basically a lot of fraud going on, a lot of banks failing, and people kept losing their money again and again and again. So there was a lot of mistrust in the banking system. And so at one point someone had the bright idea and said, okay, why don't we have this one standardized agency that will, from now on, sort of certify banks? That if you're a bank, we'll go in and examine you, and we'll go in and make sure that you are acting according to our standards. And if you do that, we'll continue to let you operate. If you don't do that, we won't let you operate anymore. This theoretically should have restored consumer confidence in the banking industry. And it wasn't going to be that these guys were just going to subject every bank to their supervision. It was going to be that if you were going to be a new bank and wanted to be nationally chartered, you would go to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, and you would ask for a charter, and you would sort of submit yourself to their whims. They would be regulating you. And so this was on top of any sort of state regulation that you were currently subject to. Then, after the banking panics in the 1910s, the Federal Reserve was established.
Question. So that was established towards the end of
1863.
And then it was done away with at a certain point?
No, OCC was not done away with. What you might be thinking of, we had several central banks before the Federal Reserve. That's what I introduced in the Federal Reserve Unit, and those were done away with.
Okay.
But this is not a bank in itself. This is sort of just a bank certifier.
Okay.
Does that make
To this
sense?
day, the
Yeah, OCC exists. OCC is responsible for regulating national chartered banks to this day. So, national chartered banks and thrifts now that the OTS is gone. But yeah, the Bank of America is the, well, and we'll get to what chartering means hopefully a little later. But basically when you're a bank, you get to decide where you want to set up. I want to set up in Maine, you might want to set up in South Carolina. And that we say that you're chartered in that state. But some banks decided that, hey, we'll set up everywhere. We'll just be, we'll be nationally chartered. And so that's what the OCC was going to take care of. And there's a lot of restrictions for state chartered banks. Okay. And then what happened is banking panics of 1910, this sort of precipitated the Federal Reserve, but basically with the introduction of the Federal Reserve, you had not two regulators, the OCC and the state, but now you had a third regulator. Anybody who wanted to be Federal Reserve member, anyone who wanted access to the discount window and other goodies that the Federal Reserve is meant to do, had to abide by the Federal Reserve's rules. So you have a third layer of regulation. And then finally, in the post-Great Depression period, are there any history buffs here? Yeah? Do you happen to know what FDR's first act of Congress, or first act as a president was?
No.
It was to declare a banking moratorium. This was after just insane volume and effect of bank runs. They had like a whole week where something like 2,000 banks failed, or maybe I'm exaggerating, you guys can look up the numbers, but it was just a huge banking panic in the United States. FDR got elected, stepped in, said, everyone, you can no longer use the banks until we fix this problem. So all the businessmen didn't have access to their money, all the housewives didn't have access to their money, nobody had any money for, I think it was like a few days or a week or something. And what came out of this moratorium of, what's that?
What'd you call that? The bank?
Moratorium. Comes from the word morte, dead. So banking is dead for a few days. And so Congress all met and all assembled, and they very, very quickly passed this Banking Act of 1933. You guys don't have to remember dates in my class, but this was the Banking Act that set up two very important things. One was it set up the Glass-Steagall Act, which we'll come back to, which was very important.
Isn't that a big deal?
It's a big deal.
You know?
Yeah, no.
I've been hearing about it, but I don't know.
Exactly, and hopefully I'll get to introduce to you why it was a big deal. And
Can you repeat the name of that again?
Glass-Steagall, named after two senators, Glass-Steagall. And for everyone else who doesn't like listening to me talk, I can write it too. Glass-Steagall. Now I'm wondering if there's two or one else. We're gonna say one because two looks too much like seagull. Okay, so the Glass-Steagall Act did something very important. It said that, look, a lot of the reasons that banks are failing is because they're taking on too many risks and they're not being specialists. We need to restore bankers to the business of banking. We don't need bankers in insurance. We don't need bankers in real estate. We don't need bankers in car manufacturing. We want bankers to be specialists in banking. Okay? And more important than insurance and car manufacturing was issuing and underwriting debt securities. As a result of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933, bankers were no longer allowed to underwrite securities for companies. That'll become important in 1999. So the second important thing that this Banking Act of 1933 did is set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Aren't you happy they did that?
Pardon?
Aren't you happy they did
I'm very happy. Had a lot of good times there. So, this was meant to, and hopefully we'll be able to get to deposit insurance next class, but this was meant to also restore faith in the banking system. And how they meant to do that is to say that everyone's deposits up to $100,000 are going to be insured. So, guys, if you have less than $100,000 in the bank, don't worry about bank running because you'll get your money one way or the other. As long as the U.S. government is solvent, you will get your money. So, I think this helps. But what this also did is created now 4 layers of regulation. The state, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC. Each had their own set of rules. There were some banks that were subject to the whims of each one of these regulators. And if you'll talk to any banker, they'll tell you about the really high regulatory costs, compliance costs. You have to do everything that the regulator wants you to do. And that's really annoying, and that gets in the way of making a lot of money sometimes. So, there were a bunch of rules. And, yeah, Jack?
Before you get too far ahead, what you said banks are no longer allowed to underwrite what?
Underwrite debt securities.
Okay.
And I didn't really cover what underwrite public debt securities, I should say.
They said company debt securities.
One more time?
I thought you said they're not allowed to write company debt securities.
Yeah, public company debt
Okay.
securities. Those are the only ones that really. Basically, what's a debt security? A debt security is a loan, but a debt security is a loan from all the investors in the bond market, right? Versus a bank is allowed to underwrite a loan to a company, but just that bank gives their money to the company. So underwriting traditionally means just like doing a lot of due diligence about the company, doing a lot of investigation, pricing everything correctly, and selling it to the market. Banks were no longer allowed to do that. But banks can still give loans to companies if they needed it. Make sense? Okay. Yeah, so all these agencies had rules, and one of the surest things in life is when you have rules, you will have people exploiting loopholes in rules. And that very attribute of rules is responsible for a lot of the banking system that we see today. So, we talked about one rule already, is the Fed's reserve requirement. Can somebody remind me what that requirement is? Not number-wise, but what it means?
Banks must hold a certain amount in an account with the Federal Reserve.
Yes, that's exactly true. And more specifically, they must hold a certain percentage of X with, what's that?
Deposits?
Deposits, yes. For every dollar of deposits they have, the Federal Reserve says you need to have 3 cents or 5 cents or 15 cents on account with us. Those are your reserve requirements. So that was one rule. Okay. And also sort of an interesting consideration is up until 2008, the Federal Reserve did not pay interest on these reserves. So banks had to hold money on account with the Fed, and it was basically just like putting cash under your mattress. In 2008, to try to stabilize the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve started giving a tiny sliver of interest just so banks wouldn't keep their reserve levels at the absolute minimum. So they would just throw a little extra on there. So from 2008 onward, the Federal Reserve pays interest on reserves. But prior to that, he was even more costly. And another thing, and I don't know who's responsible for this bright idea, but there were also restrictions on deposit rates, deposit interest rate. Okay, this was basically had to do with savings accounts. There was a hard cap of 5% on what a bank could pay its customers to have a savings account at the bank. A bank could pay no more than 5% on a savings account. Okay? Which, at the time this regulation was probably put in place, seemed fairly reasonable. We haven't really experienced super high inflation. There's no reason why savings accounts, which traditionally earn less than 1%, should ever have to go above 5%. But that'll come back. And a third requirement, this is a state-by-state thing, is restrictions on branching. Okay? And what this meant was that states set up requirements. Some states said that, look, one bank can have at most one branch. Cannot be a bank with multiple branches. A more common rule was a restriction on interstate branching. That is, if a bank is chartered in Arkansas, they can have a few branches in Arkansas, we'll be cool with that, but they can't set up a bank in Oklahoma. So Oklahoma would write a prohibition on interstate branching. They wouldn't let other state chartered banks branch into their state, if that makes sense. Okay. Now, I want to ask you guys a question. Why might a state do that? Does anyone have any guesses on what an advantage of sort of reducing the scope of a bank might be?
Keep all the business at their bank, increase their assets.
So a bank might want to do that, but from a state's perspective, why does Oklahoma prefer not to have Arkansas, so you're saying Oklahoma might prefer not to have Arkansas banks come in because they don't want Oklahoma money going out? Okay, that makes sense. That's a good answer. Does anyone?
Do they pay taxes in the place that they're chartered?
Yes, that gives them even more incentive, so they'll pay income taxes, So now, okay, yes, and I know for a fact that if an Oklahoma bank were to have a branch in Arkansas, then they would have to pay taxes to Arkansas because it's where the income was earned. So if the income was earned in Arkansas, then they have to pay Arkansas taxes. That's another way for Oklahoma to keep more tax money. That makes sense. How about from a safety perspective? Can anyone give me an argument why it might be safer not to have interstate branching or even branching within a state?
I guess they said something about the McFadden Act and anti-competitive force in commercial banking, and also historically been against banks gaining too much power.
Okay, I don't know that much about the act, so Crystal, do you want to tell us more?
No, That's what I read earlier.
Okay, that act has something to do with it, but the question is, why don't they want banks to have too much power? And the answer is contagion. So if you'll think about, let's see, we have different municipalities here, and this bank has branches all over here, and this is state A, this is state B, whereas we have this bank with branches here. If this bank suddenly failed, this state A bank made a lot of bad decisions, and it has to go out of business now. All its, sort of a lot of its depositors who have more than 250,000 will lose all their money, right? And including these depositors. So because of a mismanagement from the state regulators in state A, people who live in state B lost their money. And now that's going to make the economies of state B worse off. And so these people are going to be poorer. And so now if the people that lived here had loans with this bank and with that one, then they lost all their money with this bank, they're not going to be able to pay loans with that bank. And so now maybe that branch might start doing bad and this bank might fail. So having banks that operate across the country is a channel of contagion. That is how, you guys know the word contagious? When someone's sick, if they can spread their germs to someone else, it's contagious. In the banking literature, the word contagion is a very important word. It's how risk transfers from one entity to the other. And if we don't take significant countermeasures, then we might have a lot of contagion in our banking system. And so one way to reduce the contagion was to just say that, look, nobody from any other state could come in and bank at our state. And this can even happen at a municipality level. Municipalities say, look, we'll only allow one branch for any particular bank, so that if more starts having financial problems, Chickasha doesn't have to suffer for it. Does that make sense, Fabian?
My only confusion is what happens to the national banks like Bank of America or something like that?
So those banks were nationally chartered, and so they can set up anywhere they want. This is for state chartered banks.
Okay.
And because the state doesn't have control of what happens at the national level. Undue burden on interstate commerce. A good question.
I was just getting confused. I was like, I know that there's banks.
Yeah, so I mean, Bank of America,
I guess they get away with it by setting up bank holding companies.
yes. And so that's how banks circumvent this. So once these restrictions started being too burdensome, what banks did was say, fine, there's a rule that says we can't have a bank that has multiple branches. But there's no rule that says somebody who owns this bank also can't own a different bank, right? And so what there was is all the national banks had, were structured in a bank holding company structure where they had one parent company that owned banks in wherever these national holding companies, these national banks wanted to set up. Okay? So this is basically a shell corporation. This corporation's job is to do nothing, just to collect papers, right? And it has one bank in South Dakota, one bank in North Dakota, one bank in Idaho, and it just collects all the papers from all these banks, and all the profits go here, and that way they're not subject to the interstate banking regulations. So again, we have a case where we have our best intentioned rules being met with the private sector, who's always much better at regulators and finding loopholes. So there were loopholes. So just one of several loopholes. Yes. And okay. So reserve requirements, that's not going away. Restrictions on deposit rates got fixed in 1980. Restrictions on branching got fixed state by state, and I think that act that Crystal talked about, McFadden something, that did away with this officially. I want to say that's 94. Back me up, Crystal.
Oh, I don't know.
It's not important. it's not gonna come up in the testimony, but, or maybe it is important.
So that's just protection and branching for state banks.
Yes,
State
and almost all banks are state chartered. Almost all sounds like it's 95%. Really, realistically, something 60 to 80% are state chartered banks.
What, the 1994 passage of the Regal Nil Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act?
That's the one I'm thinking, not the McFadden, the
Okay.
Regal Neal Franking Efficiency.
Does that say 1994 or 1894?
1994.
94. 1994. So that did away with interstate banking restrictions. Okay, so let's think about what happened to banks during the 70s. In the mid to late 70s, we know that as a result of several things, including the oil crisis and some other stuff, inflation was really high in this country.
Wait, it was either that or the Graham-Leach.
Graham-Leach Bliley was 99. We'll get to that one.
Okay.
Yep. So the yes, in the I think it might have even started in the 60s, but definitely in the 70s. If you look at U.S. interest rates, let's call this 1950. It looks something like this, with this year around 1979, 1980. And so the magnitudes here are, I think, something like 15 to 18%. I don't know exactly what the number is. There's a graph in your books if you're interested. But basically what this does is, what's going to happen to interest rates that banks pay on deposits if inflation gets super high? Think about this for a minute, okay? So if I'm a consumer and I'm worried about my dollar being worth much less in a year than it is today, am I going to want to save more or spend more? Spend more. Do we all see why? Okay, if I want to spend more, what's going to happen to how much money I put into savings accounts and checking accounts? It's going to go down. If that goes down, what's going to happen to the amount of funds that banks have to work with? How much money they have to play with? It's going to go down. If they don't have any money to play with, they can't make loans. It's bad for our economy. So that's the ultimate impact. But what happens in the short term, before we catch on to all this, is that these deposit accounts are hitting their rate ceilings. So now you go outside, and every bank, outside every bank and savings and loan and credit union has a sign that says 5% on deposits, 5% on deposits. And still, you know that inflation's like 10%. So you're not going to put your money in any of these banks. What are you going to do with it, though? Well, in the 60s or 70s, maybe Crystal, if you have it in front of you, you can tell us. But in the 60s or 70s, there was something called a money market mutual fund set up. And it really screwed people over. I'm going to abbreviate this MMMF from now on. So money market mutual funds basically took as a starting point, okay, we know if you put your money in a bank, you're going to get 5% on it. We'll pay you 5 1/4. How does that sound? We're not a bank account, so we can choose whatever we pay you. We'll pay you 5 1/4, and all the money's going to come flooding into us. We're going to invest that money in the money market. Now, you very attentive students who know very well by now what the money market is, what is it?
Short term.
Yes, short term, right? So examples of money market instruments are T-bills, commercial paper, I know is one of them. I have the third one written down. Oh yeah, CDs. Certificates of deposit. Certificates of deposit are, sort of, they're also called time deposits. You give your money to a bank, promise to hold it in for X amount of time, and they can pay you whatever interest rate they want. those CDs were not subject to the 5% deposit rate ceilings. Those were only for savings accounts. So this money market mutual fund comes along, and it's a mutual fund like any other mutual fund where just a bunch of investors throw their money in it and they get to decide what they invest in. And they decided to invest in really short-term liquid instruments, because all of these instruments were yielding much more than 5% at the time. If inflation's going to be 10%, so a year from now my money is going to be worth 10% less, and I'm a corporation and I want to borrow money, sure, I'll issue a loan for 9%. I don't care. I'm still making money here. So these money market mutual funds invested in the money market, and not only that, but they said, look, investors, if you ever want your money back, we can give you your money. In fact, you can even write checks on your account with us. So these MMFs were basically the introduction of shadow banking, as it's called. And it's banking, bless you, without a bank. So this was the first serious case where banks had to wonder, we don't have a business model that can survive anymore. And so when banks began wondering that, bank regulators caught on and they repealed this restriction on deposit rate ceilings, and so deposit rates could now fluctuate to move with market demand. And so banks could still be a little viable. But there were negative consequences associated with that as well. And those are the consequences that probably 6 or 7 of you guys are going to tell me about in the S&L crisis. When you talk about your banks that failed during the savings and loan crisis, you will talk about how, hopefully maybe, how the removal of these restrictions allowed banks to compete with one another. And the competition got so cutthroat that banks were paying way too much for their funds, or savings and loans were paying way too much for their funds. So you'll probably do a better job of explaining it than I will. I'll leave that to you. Yeah, and so shadow banking, money market mutual funds. This was a way that the private sector came up with a creative solution to circumvent government regulation, to get around regulation. This was a problem, this was a solution. We already talked about how the private sector, no, we didn't talk about it. Another thing that the private sector came up with was sweep accounts. So, sweep accounts basically operate under the following premise. So, I'm a bank and you're a depositor. And you invest your money with me. It's a checking account that you have with me. And on a checking account, I can't legally pay you any money, because this was before NOW accounts were invented, interest-bearing checking accounts. So I can't pay you any money on your deposit account with me. And so, but you still want to have some kind of liquidity. You don't care that I can't pay you money. You want to have $25,000 in there at all times, just because you're a businessman, and in case you need the expenses, you need access to it. But what about the rest of the money? You gave me $100,000, and you really need access to $25,000. We can set up this agreement where every night I will take the $75,000, I will turn it into a interest-bearing account, so either a savings account or put it in commercial paper. There's overnight commercial paper, or lend it out to other banks who need to meet their reserve requirements. Not sure exactly what you do with it, but it gets swept out of the account, if that makes sense. So there's a balance of $100,000. Every night, you take this portion, move it into another instrument. The sun comes up. It's the morning now. You take this money and move it back in. So the next day, you'll have $100,014, let's say, in your account. Because every night, they take this money, move it out to an interest-bearing account, move it back in. Now, the other interesting thing about this, so this not only was beneficial to the consumers, who got more money instead of not having any money, so they got around this restriction on deposit rates, they also got around the reserve requirements. Because if it's not a deposit account anymore, if we buy commercial paper with it, or we do a repo for government security or something, it's not a deposit account. So when that bank closes, they don't have this money in their deposit accounts anymore. So they have to have less reserves at the Federal Reserve. Everybody wins. This is another creative solution that the private sector came up with to circumvent government regulations. Private sector is really good at doing that. And then we get to the ultimate regulation that the private sector circumvented. You guys like my son? No? All right. So we talked about Glass-Steagall Act. What's up, Sam? Just in time for the juiciest part of this.
I got it.
Just in time.
They sent me a memo that said class was at 7:30.
Since you know the class was getting
That
out.
was, okay, that was a joke, huh? All right, I see how to do it.
It's a tough crowd today. They didn't even like my picture of the song.
It's nice.
We're hurting without you, Sam.
Hmm?
We're hurting without you. We need the energy that you bring to the class.
Woo!
Let's
go.
All right. So we mentioned the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, which one of your classmates can give you a good description of what the Glass-Steagall Act did?
Same
I forgot my notes.
Understand. All right. How about from this side of the room? We don't always hear a lot of talking.
To historic bankers to be bankers, not insurance agents on the roads.
Yes.
Sorry.
Dang, I knew that.
What's that?
I remember reading that.
Yeah. So this was the act. The most important thing that this act did. Glass-Steagall.
From 1933, right?
What is separated commercial and investment
It's all back
banking?
now.
What's that, Crystal?
Separated commercial and investment banking.
Separated commercial investment banking. That's a technical way of saying it. So investment banking's primary role is to underwrite debt securities, corporate public debt securities. Okay? Commercial banking's primary role is to take in deposits and give out loans. In separating investment banking from commercial banking, it meant that the people who are taking in deposits and giving out loans can now not also use that money to underwrite companies and issue debt securities for those companies.
They still have, like, you're talking about separating commercial from investment, right? But you go to banks, they just have brokers there that do.
So this
but
now,
they separate them from.
and that's I think that's
You can still buy mutual funds, you can buy certain things from brokers that, I mean, they're still investing.
right. They're investing and they're structured as a different entity, and they have to have a sign that says we are not FDIC insured.
Yeah.
We are not part of it. But that is the case now in the new regulatory climate past Glass-Steagall.
Yeah.
But before Glass-Steagall, I'm not sure if they were allowed to do that.
Well, isn't there a new,
I'm sorry, before the repeal of Glass-Steagall. So this was Glass-Steagall in 1933. This said that you couldn't marry those two business lines.